So I'm going to tell you a story like that, and it's the story of Marduk, and it's the Mesopotamian story. And Mesopotamia is one of the earliest civilizations, and it emerged as a consequence of the amalgam of Middle Eastern tribes. So that over a very long period of time. You could think the gods of all of these tribes were warring in an abstract space, in a conceptual space, and that would be the space of argumentation and conflict. And out of that a meta-story emerged. And this is the meta-story, and it's one of a host of similar meta-stories that came out of the Middle East, one of which is the account in Genesis. Okay, so here's the story. So there are two primary deities to begin with, Apsu and Tiamat. Now in order to understand that, well, here's how the Mesopotamians conceptualized the world. There was a, let's call it a disk, that's salt water. Well, why? Well, what happens when you go to the end of the continent? There's salt water everywhere, right? So wherever you go, you run into salt water. So that's the disk that surrounds everything. Now, why is it a disk? The world is a dome on a disk. Why? Well, say you're standing in the middle of a field. What does the world look like? A dome on a disk. So it's a phenomenological representation. So the bottom of the dome is the ground on which you stand. What happens if you dig? You hit water, fresh water. So the dome of the land is on a disk of fresh water. What happens if you go to the edge of the land? You run into salt water. The dome of the land is on a disk of fresh water on a disk of salt water. Okay, those are the two gods. Tiamat is god of salt water, and Apsu is god of fresh water. And it's happenstance in some sense, because that's the masculine and the feminine, and they could be attributed all sorts of different geographical areas. So for example, see if I can think of a good example. It doesn't matter, I'll just leave that for now. Okay, so the two primary gods are Apsu and Tiamat. Tiamat is female and Apsu is male, and they're locked together in an inseparable embrace. Okay, so how do you understand that? Easy. Yin and yang. It's the same idea. Here's another representation. This is a cool one. I've got a couple of them here that are really cool. This is from China. So this is Fuxi and Nuwa. I think I've got that right. But I just love that representation. It's so insanely cool, this representation. So you see the sort of the primary mother and father of humanity emerging from this underlying snake-like entity with its tails tangled together. I think that's I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. So, and that representation, that entwined double helix, that is everywhere. You can see it in Australian Aboriginal art, and I'm using the Australians as an example because they were isolated in Australia for like 50,000 years. They're the most archaic people that were ever discovered, and they have clear representations of these double helix structures in their art. So, and those are the two giant serpents out of which the world is made, roughly speaking. It's the same thing, you see that in the staff of Asclepius, which is the healing symbol that physicians use, although usually that's only one snake, but sometimes it's two. So that's a Chinese representation, and then there's this. That's the Egyptian representation. We talked about the Egyptian story the other day, right? We talked about Isis and Osiris. So there they are, cobras. Their tails are twined together. See, they emerge out of that. That's the dragon of chaos that manifests itself as culture and nature. That's the representation. That's unbelievably cool. So, okay. So, anyways, back to the Mesopotamian story. So, Apsu and Tiamat are the primordial deities, nature and culture. They're entwined together, and they give rise to their first category of children, and those are I think you could think about them as the elder gods. Now, what do they represent? Well, the question is, what do the gods represent? And they represent sort of like primary modes of being. It's something like that. So think about Ares, or Mars, the god of war. Well, that's that's a representation of single-minded aggression. And then you can think about Eros or Venus, which is a primary representation of sexuality. And you might say, well, why are those deities? Well, that's simple. They live forever, and they control you, and their personalities. So that's that. For that, it's like, yes, obviously. You know, and you know that you're under the sway of anger, you're not in control of yourself. If you're under the sway of erotic possession, you make a fool out of yourself. You're a tool of the power that drives the continuation of the species forward. Hunger is the same thing. Any primordial motivational drive we've conceptualized in this class as a personality. But those are transcendent personalities, and they're eternal. They're forever. And so that's why the Greeks, for example, thought that human beings were just the playthings of the gods. And this idea is echoed in the Mesopotamian stories. So then you can think about it sort of neurodevelopmentally as well, is that out of nothing, out of culture and nature, emerges, say, the 2-year-old. The 2-year-old is a battleground of primary motivational forces. And something like that is being hinted at in the Mesopotamian creation story. The first progeny of the fundamental union of chaos and order, Apsu and Tiamat, is the proliferation of these primary motivational forces. They're sort of like the Titans, or the what was it the Greek gods kept underneath the mountain? That's Zeus. What's the name of that? They're like they're earthquakes and fires and that sort of thing. They're primordial forces. Okay, anyways, so these children are produced, and what happens? They're very noisy. They run around doing all sorts of things. You could think about them as grown-up 2-year-olds causing all sorts of trouble. The first thing they do is kill Apsu and make their home on his corpse. It's brilliant. Now the story doesn't say much about Apsu other than that. The culture deity, the primary culture deity is not elaborated up that much in the Mesopotamian story. And I think that's probably because at the time of the Mesopotamian, civilization was new enough so that we really hadn't mapped the mythology of culture. The Egyptians did that much more, and I know I told you that story first, but that's just how it goes. So the elder gods make their home on the corpse of Apsu. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's sort of how it is. You inhabit the corpse of culture, right? It's the dead past. But it's not just the dead past. One of the things that's very cool about the Mesopotamian story is that the elder gods are foolish enough to kill it. It's the death of God, by the way. It's no different from what Nietzsche pronounced. This has been going on for a very, very long time, this collapse of belief systems. They kill it carelessly because they don't understand what it is that they need to survive. They kill it carelessly, and then they try to live on the corpse. I think that's what the postmodernists do, by the way, because they assume we have this tremendous system of value that's been built up across time, and it sustains us, and everyone is criticizing it and trying to destroy it. And it's, well, we live in its corpse, and that won't nourish us forever. It has to be replenished, and there's nothing in the postmodernist philosophy that can act to replenish. Anyways, they kill Apsu. What happens when you kill order? Chaos comes back. Tiamat. Now this is Tiamat. Here. Feminine, but also the dragon. So it's you think, out of this fundamental reptilian treasure bearer, culture and nature emerge. And they can pull back into that very rapidly. So here's an example. You've all seen Sleeping Beauty, I presume. How many of you have seen Sleeping Beauty, the Disney film? How many of you haven't? Okay, so there's a couple that haven't. There's a scene in Sleeping Beauty where the evil queen has imprisoned the prince who's going to wake Sleeping Beauty up. So he's the logos, or he's the heroic individual, or he's that element of her consciousness that wakes her up. You can read it either way. She's got him trapped in a dungeon, so she's the kind of ultimate Oedipal mother, you know. She's the mother that has her 40-year-old son in the basement who's like overweight and unhealthy and watching video games and being covered with Cheeto dust, and she always like feeds him sandwiches so he won't leave, you know. And she says, oh, it's a good thing you didn't go out in the world and make some poor woman miserable. So anyway, so that's the evil queen. He's got the hero trapped in the dungeon. So he goes out, he escapes, and then she goes after him to try to bring him back and turns into the dragon. That's what happens in Sleeping Beauty. So that's that reversion of the archetype into its even more primordial force. So anyway, so Tiamat is kind of an amalgam of feminine nature and also this more underlying primordial symbol. So anyway, she is not happy. She is not happy that her children killed her husband. And so she thinks, oh well, enough of these creatures, we're gonna do them in. It's a flood myth. It's the same idea. So what happens in the story of Noah, this happens worldwide, is that human beings get all corrupt and make a lot of racket and break all sorts of rules, and God thinks, oh well, you know, enough of you, we'll just bring in a flood and wipe you all out. That's chaos returning. You destabilize order too badly. There's a flood, and that brings with it all sorts of new things because it's water, but it just drowns you. It drowns you. Now Noah is a good man, so he can ride out the flood. He's the hero that can go down into the chaos and then back up, because he hasn't let go of his morality despite the fact that the entire society has disintegrated. So he saves everything. So it's like Moses crossing the Red Sea and then coming out the other side. Same sort of idea. Anyways, so Tiamat, she's not happy. And these gods are careless too and impulsive. They're making a lot of noise, and their activity disturbs her. You know, and you can see echoes of that fear, that mythological fear, in modern consciousness, because we tell ourselves the same story, right? The story is, if we keep running around making enough racket, Mother Nature is going to take offense and wipe us out. And that's the story that's at the bottom of the sort of apocalyptic element of the global warming apocalypse. It's like, if we muck about badly enough, nature will take its revenge. Okay, fine, it's true, it's true. It's a story that's always been true. So anyways, the gods are making a lot of noise, they're being impulsive, and then they make the fatal error of killing Apsu, and that's a big mistake. And so Tiamat thinks, all right, enough of this. She wakes up and she thinks, I'm going to wipe them all out. Now these gods, they're gods, eh? I mean, they're not trivial characters, but they're pretty worried because they're gods, but Tiamat is their mother. She gave birth to them. She's Mother Nature. And if she's angry about it, then the jig's up. And so what Tiamat does is she prepares this army of monsters. And they're described. There's, I think, 13 different kinds of monsters, and they're chimeric images. They're images of, you know, they're like dragons. They're half snake and half bird and half animal, and they're monstrous images. And they're sort of the Mesopotamians' attempt to imagistically represent those things that might come forward as an onslaught. And so it generates a whole 13 major monsters and then puts a whole army behind them, and she elects one of them, Kingu is his name, as head monster. So he's, for all intents and purposes, he's an early representation of Satan. He's like king of the bad guys. And it's important to know about him because something happens later in the story. So Tiamat's preparing her army of monsters, chimeras, to wipe out the gods. And so they're like shorting out about this, but while they're doing it, they're still making a lot of racket and living the high life in Apsu's corpse and propagating. And while they're doing that, they send out one god after another to combat Tiamat. And they all come back failed. So whatever these elder gods are, whatever they represent, they're not whatever it is that can confront chaos successfully and prevail. They're powers, but they're not whatever that is, that ultimate power. And that's what the Mesopotamians are trying to figure out. Who or what is king of the gods? And king of the gods is the thing that confront chaos and regenerate order. So they keep producing new gods, and one day they produce Marduk. He's born, and Marduk is a whole new category of god, and every one of the gods knows it, and he's got some very strange attributes. One of them is he can speak magic words. And so when Marduk speaks, the night sky transforms into the day sky and vice versa. So he's the verbal capacity. It's a massive discovery. It's a massive discovery by the Mesopotamians, because it's the first time we know of that the idea that it's the capacity for communicative speech as the primary deity should be at the top of the dominance hierarchy. It's one of the most remarkable discoveries of the ages. And he also has eyes all the way around his head. So Marduk is the thing that can speak and see. And it's the thing that's, so all the gods think, wow, well this is a whole new thing, man. How about you go out and combat Tiamat? well, it doesn't sound like much of a picnic, you know. The logical thing for any sensible God to say is, how about no? But Marduk doesn't say that. He says, look, I'll make you guys a deal. You get yourself together in a hall, you know, and you have a vote, for all intents and purposes, and you vote me king of the gods, and allow me from here on in to determine destinies. That's exactly what the Mesopotamians say. He gets the tablet of destiny, and he's now in control of it. So the Mesopotamians are working out this idea that it's the thing that can see and that can talk that should be the thing that guides destiny, especially if destiny involves having to go into combat with chaos itself and restructure the world. And so Marduk says, those are the terms. I'll do it, but I'm king of the gods. And they all think, well, the fool's going to go out there and get killed anyway, so, you know, what do we have to lose? And so they agree, and so Marduk goes out to combat Tiamat, and he takes a net and a sword, and he, if I remember correctly, he fills her with a wind, which is, I believe, part of the manifestation of this voice idea. He fills her with a wind, he encapsulates her in a net. Now think about what that means. You know, psychologists even use this phrase, nomological net. And a nomological net is the network of concepts that you use to encapsulate something new in an ideational structure. And so the idea of putting something in a net is to put boundaries around it, right? And to constrain it. And so some of that's actually, well, you can capture a predator in a net and then cut it up. But there's no difference between that. There's a tight analogy between that and encapsulating something novel in a conceptual network, which then enables you to cut it up into something useful. Okay, so that's what happens. Marduk goes out, he confronts Tiamat, he overcomes the monsters, and he kills Kingu. And so, and then he cuts Tiamat into pieces, and he makes the world. And then that's the world that human beings live on. And he makes the human beings to serve the gods. Okay, so that's the first part of the story. Now he also kills Kingu, and he makes human beings out of the blood of Kingu. Now that's a hell of a story, right? Because Kingu is king of the demons, and human beings are the creature that's made out of the blood of the king of the demons. And it's a very similar idea to the later sort of Egyptian and Judeo-Christian ideas that there's a satanic element to being that's also characteristic of human beings. And part of that is, well, what's the difference between human beings and every other element of being? And the answer to that is, human beings can deceive you, right? We're the only creatures that can do that. We're capable of deception, voluntary deception. We're capable of malevolence. And so that's echoed as well in the story in Genesis, because when Adam and Eve eat the apple, they wake up, the scales fall from their eyes, they recognize that they're naked, and they know the difference between good and evil, which means they can do evil. And it took me a long time to figure that out, what that meant. So imagine, because there's a causal sequence, hey? The snake offers you something that you ingest, it wakes you up. The scales fall from your eyes, so now you can see. The first thing you do is you realize that you're naked. Well, what does that mean? Well, human beings stand upright. The most vulnerable part of us is front and center. To be hurt, but also to be judged, right? To be naked is to be, that's terrifying. You want to not die. You want to cover yourself up. And so that's the recognition of nakedness. But then you might say, well, why does the knowledge of good and evil emerge from that? As soon as you know you're naked and vulnerable, you know how to hurt other people. You're not a predator anymore, because they'll just tear you apart and eat you. Like, they don't want you to suffer, although they don't care. They don't want you to suffer, they just want to eat you. But once I know what hurts me, I know what hurts you. And then I can turn that into an art, and people have done that. And so that's why the knowledge of evil comes immediately as a consequence of the knowledge of nakedness. And that's associated with the same idea that human beings are made out of the blood of Kingu. Nasty stories, but very, you know, they're messing with the fundamental structure of reality. They want to get this right. Okay, so one of the cool things about this story, so that's Marduk. Now, here's what's so interesting about that. The Mesopotamians, they've got this story about the deities and how they organized themselves to respond to the emergence of chaos and how to master it. You go after it, you declare yourself the thing at the top of the dominance hierarchy, your eyes and speech, you go out there voluntarily, you encapsulate the chaos, you cut it into pieces, and you make the world. That makes you top god. Brilliant, bloody, absolutely phenomenally brilliant. So what happens, that's what's happening in the heavenly domain, let's say. What happens in the earthly domain? the emperor of the Mesopotamians is Marduk. He's the manifestation of Marduk on earth. And he has to be a good Marduk. That's the, because he might say, well, why should you be king? Well, the answer to that is, well, you're most powerful. No, that's not going to work. Some other weasels will take you out. Why should you be king? Well, because you pay attention and you speak properly and you keep chaos at bay and you make ingenious things happen as a consequence. So that's what the bloody Mesopotamians were trying to work out. What should be sovereign and why? Okay, so what did they do? In the New Year's ceremony, so imagine that the king is in a walled city, right? So that's, the king's at the top of the dominance hierarchy. He's the eye at the top of the pyramid in a walled city with chaos outside. Chaos is outside. That's the domain of Tiamat. At the New Year's ceremony, the old year, we know about that, we still have this idea. The old year is an old man. The new year is about to be born. There's an intermediary period of chaos. That's New Year's Eve, right? That's the intermediate period of chaos where all the rules are temporarily suspended, which is why you can go out and party like there's no tomorrow, New Year's Eve, and before the new year is born. The Mesopotamian emperor and all of his retinue and the people go outside the city on New Year's Eve, and they take statues that represent the gods and they act out the story that I just told you with the statues. And as part of that, the emperor has to take off all his garbs, his garments that make him king, and kneel in front of the priest, and the priest, if I remember correctly, slaps him with a glove, it's something like that, and tells him that he has to tell everyone why in the last year he wasn't a very good Marduk and how he's going to do better in the future, which is exactly, by the way, what you do when you make your New Year's, what do you call those? Yes, the ones you immediately break the next day. But it's the same, it's this renewal idea, and it happens in the depth of darkness in the middle of the winter before the light comes back, right? That's why it's set up that way. So anyways, and so as long as the emperor is a good Marduk, then that's why he gets to be emperor. And if he's not a good Marduk, then, well, someone else should be emperor. So that's how that works. And there's some representations of it, eh? So there's Tiamat there, sort of a spirit-matter combination, winged dragon, right, the thing that we've seen so many times. And there's Marduk, he's got angel wings. Now why the wings? I don't know exactly why the wings. I mean, he's obviously being assimilated to the idea of a bird. I don't know if the idea of the far-seeing capacity of the bird was there for the Mesopotamians. It's highly probable. But also the bird is something that flies up above everything else and that can see for long distances. So it's an aerial spirit, it's close to God and all of that. So there's a very primordial representation of the same thing. Look, how much imagination does it take to see that that's the story of human beings encountering the unknown? You know, when you know the code, it just seems self-evident. Yes, well, he's got his bow and arrow, you know, and he's out there fighting the monsters of the unknown, and that's how human beings have survived. You see, yeah, and then you see here he's riding this great big snake, so that's another representation of the same kind of thing.